Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Gail Vittori, board member of the Green Building Certification Institute.
Good morning. It's really great to be here and have an opportunity to be part of what is the first Master Speaker session for Greenbuild 2014. I hope you're as excited about what Katharine is going to be covering as I am. And even though climate change is not in the newspaper today, because sometimes it is in the newspaper, we know that climate change is a reality that has inspired us to do some of the most deep, searching work that brings us together here at Greenbuild and has us be active in all the ways we are in the places where we live and work. The Master Speaker sessions are really, I think, very special because it gives us all a chance to sit back and listen to someone who's going to be providing inspiring words to really reflect upon, and I think with the first Master Speaker session this morning, an opportunity to really have that be a touchstone for this whole Greenbuild as we are here for the next couple days. It's particularly important that we recognize what happened in New Orleans 9 years ago, and to understand that the scientific community had anticipated that sort of calamity, unfortunately, which caused such tremendous strife and challenges for everyone here in this town. I think it's really a reason why there's a call to action to listen and be understanding from scientists like Katharine what the challenges are and how to get ourselves on a path that moves us towards a safe and secure future. I have worked for years on public health and healthcare issues, and it was very moving to me when I heard an announcement from The Lancet, a British medical journal, a few years ago that stated that global climate change was the single largest threat to public health of this century. So we know we have challenges. We also know that we're all here together at Greenbuild because they're great opportunities to move forward and get us on a path that's going to secure our future for ourselves and for future generations. Katharine Hayhoe is an associate professor at Texas Tech University. She's a fellow Texan, and I'm thrilled to have met someone who I previously didn't know before this Greenbuild. She's also the founder and CEO of Atmos Research, where her scientific research focuses on establishing the basis for assessing regional to local scale impacts of climate change. She also mentioned to me that a group that she views as one of the most active and effective on the Texas Tech campus is their local USGBC chapter. So I think she's probably inspiring them and vice versa. To have people like Katharine who are scientists, she's studied physics, astronomy, has a PhD in atmospheric science, who are really leading the way and setting the course for what our work is about and has to be. So with that, please provide a warm welcome for Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you, Gail, for that kind introduction. It's great to be here with you today. How many people have had gumbo yet? A lot. How many people have had beignets? Yes. How many people are worried that they're going to have to roll us into the airport after we're done? Yes, me too. Luckily, I'm not staying the whole week. If I was, I probably would be. I am really excited to be able to talk to you today about the issue of climate change. And in fact, I think I can move away here. You can probably hear me even better. I study climate change every day. And almost every day, I get people asking me questions about climate change. How do we know it's real? Why do we think it's humans that are causing climate change and not a natural cycle? Why do we care about this when there's so many other bigger issues in the world to care about? And lastly, what can we do about this problem? Because it sure seems like a huge problem, and we are just one individual in this world of 7 billion plus people. If we look at our planet, we often picture it like this, these iconic pictures from NASA. Looking at our world, We see it like this, no trace of human civilization. But that's if you look during the day. What we have to realize is, although our planet used to look like it had no trace of human civilization on it, our population is going one way fast. And because of that, when you look at the planet now at night, this is what we see. This is an actual picture from NASA. Now, I know what you're going to say. Isn't it, nighttime in China when it's daytime here? Okay, it's a composite picture. You've all heard of Photoshop? But that's what this is. It's showing the real impact of our human society on the planet that we live on. When you zoom in on the United States, you can see it even more clearly. We can probably see right where we are here in New Orleans. We also might see something else a little surprising. If you cast your eyes up to North Dakota, you might see a major metropolitan area. It isn't. This is the actual picture of what fracking looks like at night. That's how much there is going on up there. And so that's why when we're going to talk about climate change, we have to start with what I call the story of energy, because that's where the story begins. We've been using fossil fuels for a long time, but it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution when we figured out how to dig massive amounts of this stuff, coal, natural gas, and oil too, out of the ground and burn it. We have good records of how much of the stuff we've been using. We know that here in the US, we get about a third of it from industry, we use about a third of our energy in industry. We use almost a third of it in our transportation. And then here's really why we're here today, right? The rest of it gets used in our residential and our commercial buildings. So we are a big part of this story, ourselves personally and what everybody here does. All told, we use over 100 exajoules on average of energy per year. And again, a big part of that is in our built environment. Not only that, but if you look at the past 60 years, we see that there's been a huge increase in that energy. But what I was really encouraged by was the fact that there's been a plateauing of that trend in the last decade or two. And I wonder how much of that is due to the work done here. So this leads us to what I call our invisible problem. Now, we are all very familiar with the visible problems in our world. We know what mountaintop removal looks like if we look at pictures like this that Google Earth has before and after. We know what a burning oil rig looks like, or what oil pollution looks like when a tanker collapses in the Arctic. We know what air pollution looks like, because we can see these things with our eyes. But what we often don't think about is the invisible problem, and that's not the steam coming out of the smokestack here. It's the invisible gases in between. Invisible heat-trapping gases that get released whenever we burn coal or gas or oil. So I promise this is the most chemistry we're going to get to today. I know it's early in the morning. But we have this invisible problem because whenever we burn coal, gas, or oil, it produces carbon dioxide. It releases the carbon in the fuel into the atmosphere. We know that we've been producing a lot of this stuff. Even cement manufacturing produces a little bit of carbon dioxide, but most of it comes from coal, oil, and gas. If we look around the world and we add up how much of the stuff we've been burning over the last 100 years, we see that the US has produced almost a third over the last 100 years. But China is catching up quickly. A couple of years ago, China became the biggest producer of these gases, but not per person. Per person, Canada, Australia, and the US are still at the top. Our carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are going up. In fact, last year, we passed 400 for the first time, 400 parts per million. Now, to get a perspective on how unusual this is, we can go back in time. When we go back in time, we see that over the last 800,000 years, which is far longer than we've had human civilization here on this planet, if we go back 800,000 years, we see that the historical range for carbon dioxide was always between about 180 and 300. So this was the historical range, and here's where we are today. Why is this a problem? It's because our Earth has this amazing atmosphere. And what this atmosphere does is it has all of these little gases in it. These gases are transparent to energy from the sun. The sun's energy comes down, hits the Earth, and the Earth warms up. Then the Earth re-radiates heat energy, and it turns out that these little gases are very opaque to heat energy. So just like a blanket, these naturally occurring gases trap the Earth's heat inside our atmosphere, keeping us almost 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we would be otherwise. If we didn't have this amazing blanket of natural gases, we would be a frozen ball of ice, and we wouldn't be sitting here today. So what's the problem? The problem is that we are adding more of these little black dots to our atmosphere than should be naturally. And when we do that, we've increased those dots 43% so far since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And when we do that, it traps more heat, and our planet warms up. That's the invisible problem. And that's exactly what's happening to our planet. The more heat that gets trapped, the more our temperature is rising. How do we know that this is really what's happening, though? Being an earth scientist, being an atmospheric scientist, or being a climate scientist is really tough because we can't put the Earth in a test tube. People often come to campus and say, well, can I get a picture of you in your lab? And I'm like, well, my lab is actually a giant supercomputer because that's where I build my model Earth and that's where I conduct my experiments. And that doesn't quite go over the same way. They're looking for the white lab coat. I'm actually considering maybe just getting a white lab coat and putting it on to kind of fulfill the expectations. But I have to say, I've actually never worn a lab coat in my research. How do we know that this is even happening, though? Because if you turn on the news, every day we hear something about global cooling, don't we? Global warming has stopped, it's slowed down, it's even getting cooler. How many people have heard something like this in the past year or two? A fair amount of people. How do you get this? You get it by taking the global temperature record and by picking certain parts of it. And by picking small sections of the global temperature record, you can make it go up or down or even almost sideways. The reality is that we have to look at the whole record. And when we look at the whole record, it's pretty clear. Let's take those red parts away now. The planet continues to warm, and in fact, as I was running through the airport yesterday, I got 2 calls from reporters saying that NOAA has just announced that this year is probably going to be the warmest ever. Do you have any comment? It was actually kind of tough to comment because 1 year doesn't make a trend. The trend is what you're looking at here, 30, 50, 100 years. But this year reminds us that global warming has not stopped, it has not slowed down, it continues apace. But hang on, you might say, didn't we used to have like those frozen ice fairs on the Thames River and that people painted these beautiful pictures of? Didn't we used to call Greenland green? Didn't we used to be overrun by woolly mammoths? Hasn't climate change happened in the past? It definitely has happened in the past. But in the past, those changes have been quite different than today. Let me show you what I mean. Let's look, for example, at the time when Greenland was named green. Now, just so you know, it was actually a bit of a PR scheme, because by the time you got to Greenland, it was too late to go back. So Greenland was never kind of, totally ice-free when people were moving there. It was always quite cold, but it was a bit warmer than usual because during the medieval warm period, now the red colors here mean warm and the blue colors mean cooler. During the medieval warm period, it was quite warm in the northern Atlantic. But in other places, it was actually quite cold. So this is the medieval warm period, and here, just for comparison, here's the last decade. So yes, we have had warm and cool periods before, but today we're looking at warm periods all around the world. Now, some people, increasingly a large number of people, as people watch that movie about the ice ages with the squirrel and the nut and the woolly mammoths, everybody knows about the ice ages now, thanks to Pixar. So people say, well, aren't we just getting warmer after the last ice age? To look at that argument, we have to look at what causes the ice ages. And what's really interesting is that we now know, thanks to a Serbian engineer called Milankovic, who was put in it's hard to know what to call this. It wasn't a concentration camp, but it was some type of detainment camp in World War I. But it was a detainment camp that's probably an engineer's dream because he apparently had infinite amounts of paper, pencil, and free time. And with those 3 years, he actually calculated the fact that these changes in the Earth's orbit are what cause the ice ages and the warm periods like we're in today. Now, why is a picture of the pyramids up there? It's because we've also discovered, and I think this is fascinating because my own background originally comes from astronomy, we've discovered that because the tilt of the Earth's axis changes over time and wobbles, it changes what is our North Star. So then when they look at ancient monuments, they've discovered ancient monuments like some of the pyramids are very carefully aligned, pointing at nothing. And for a while that puzzled archaeologists until we figured out that they were aligned pointing at where the stars were when they were built. How cool is that? So the very same reason why so many ancient monuments are aligned pointing at nothing right now is the same reason why we have our ice ages, because the Earth's orbit changes over time. But we can actually calculate using fairly basic math. I was driving to the airport yesterday, and I passed an old gas station that had been taken over by an artist. And so the artist had used the gas station sign to say, "I haven't used algebra for 3,855 days." And I laughed when I saw that because I thought, well, I use algebra almost every day, but I sympathize with what they're trying to say. Using algebra, which this artist has not used, we can actually calculate what's going to be happening now. And when we use that algebra, and when we just look at the last few thousand years, this is what we see. We see that our temperature was actually on its way down. So you know back in the 1970s when people were talking about how maybe another ice age might be coming? Now when you say people, we actually mean 10 scientific studies and 1 Newsweek article. Just so you know, that's what people are back in the 1970s. Whereas now we have 10,000 articles on climate change and I don't know how many Newsweek stories. So just to be clear. But when people said another ice age was coming, they were right. Now, coming is a relative term geologically speaking. I used to be in a geology department and I quickly realized that what I viewed as a long time to them was like this. So when a geologist says the ice age is coming any day, they really mean the ice age is coming any 1,000 years now. But we were on our way down. Our temperature was on its way down into the next ice age until when? Until we started digging all this stuff out of the ground and burning it. That's how we know that it isn't an ice age cycle. We have indefinitely postponed the next ice age, and that's a good thing too, because we don't want to live through an ice age. Human civilization, human society didn't really develop until after the last ice age because we couldn't. Half of North America was covered in a mile of ice. It kind of puts a crimp in your plans to build a intercoastal highway. But then you might say, well, hang on. There's one more reason why we know climate changes. We know that there's these natural cycles, like El Nino, that we hear a lot about if we live in the Southwest, or the NAO that we hear a lot about if we live in the Northeast, or other natural cycles. So couldn't it be that that's causing climate change? Here's the thing, though. All these natural cycles do is move heat around the Earth system, just like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. Now, I'm kind of curious here. How many people would call this a seesaw? A few. A lot. How many people call this a teeter-totter? How many people have a totally different name for this? A couple of people. Hardly anybody's going to admit to it. I was kind of curious about that. All right. So whether you call it a seesaw, a teeter-totter, or some other thing, that is the best way to explain how natural cycles affect our planet inside the Earth system. When it's getting cooler in the Pacific, it's getting warmer in the Atlantic. If it's getting cooler up in the atmosphere where we take our temperature, it's getting warmer in the ocean. If it's getting cooler in the ocean, it's getting warmer in the atmosphere. So if our global temperature were going up because of this natural cycle all around the world, where's the most likely place that heat would be coming from? I'll give you a clue. There's only 2 choices on this slide. Any guesses? Yes, the ocean. So let's look at the heat content of the entire planet. The blue is the heat content of the ocean, and the green is the heat content of the atmosphere, land, and ice all put together. This is the increase in extra heat that's been absorbed by all these different parts of the Earth system since the 1960s. Now, honestly, when I look at this, this is kind of scary, because what this tells us is when we look at our atmospheric temperature, do you remember that kind of red jagged line I showed you earlier? When we look at our average temperature, what this shows us is that that is the tip of the iceberg, literally. That our global temperature might be going up, but that 20 times more extra heat is going into the ocean. And we're just not seeing it because that's not what we see with our eyes. Again, the invisible problem. Lastly, we can look at energy from the sun, because some people say, oh, it's sunspots, or it's this, or it's that. We know, though, that energy from the sun goes up and down over time. It has a regular 11-year sunspot cycle that was actually discovered by Galileo. It's amazing how much people knew so long ago. But over time, the sun kind of goes up and down in unpredictable ways. You might say, well, are we getting warmer because we're getting more energy from the sun? Sadly, no. We're actually getting less energy from the sun over the last 40 years. So here's something that you don't hear very often. People often say, well, how much of our warming today is being caused by humans? What would you guess? 50%, 80%, even 90%? The true number is over 100%. Over 100% of our warming today is being caused by humans because we would be cooling if we're being controlled by natural factors, by the sun, natural cycles, and the ice ages. So here's the situation we have. If it were the sun, we'd be getting cooler. If it were internal natural cycles, it can't be because the whole planet's warming. And if it were the Earth's orbit, well, the next thing coming is an ice age. In fact, I talked to you earlier about my lab, my supercomputers. Using these models, these kind of virtual Earths, we can calculate what the temperature would be on an Earth with no people, with no carbon emissions. That's the green line. We can then calculate what the temperature would be on an Earth with people and with carbon emissions. That's the blue. And then we can compare that with the real temperature of the Earth. That's the black. The bottom line is we cannot explain the warming over the past 50 or 60 years if we leave humans out of the equation. We can't explain it. And believe me, we've tried, because if I explain it, then I get to be on the cover of Scientific American. And as everybody knows, that is the pinnacle of any scientist's dream. Here's something else we don't hear a lot. That's the fact that almost all of the science I've just showed you, except for the climate model part of it, almost all of the science I've showed you has been known for a really long time. The first guy here, Fourier, is famous for many things, including the fact that he discovered this natural blanket that surrounds our planet. The Irish chemist who comes next to him was the one who discovered that by mining coal, we are actually adding to this blanket. This man here in the middle was a Swedish chemist who calculated the first climate model by hand. It took him 2 years to calculate how much the planet would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you know what? He was embarrassingly close to our most powerful supercomputers today. We have known about the science for a really long time, and that's why we are so sure. This is the perspective that we have today. 97% of scientists, 97% of the scientific literature agrees that climate is changing and it's us. But why do we care? If we're going to be honest and we think global warming, what's the first image that pops into our minds? Again, there's some help here. Polar bear often. When we think about the revolutionary changes that are required to our society, and we think about doing them all for the sake of the polar bear, it just doesn't compute. Polar bears are actually quite mean and nasty. They look all nice when you're looking at them out the window of a train, but if it were me and a polar bear on the stage, I can tell you I'd be running. And again, you only have to run faster than the person next to you. Or fast enough to trip them. That's what they teach us in Canada. Here's the thing. Rather than being viewed as scientific data and information and analyses, we have been presented with the idea of global warming as if it is a new type of religion. I can show you pictures of the Church of Al Gore that people have designed, and images and words that people use to talk about this problem as if it's a belief system that you buy into or you are brainwashed into, many people would say. Here's the thing, though, to care about climate change, we need science. Science tells us whether climate is changing. It is. Science tells us why it's changing. This time, for the first time in human history, for the first time in the history of the planet, it's us. Never has been before. And science can tell us what's going to happen. So here's what science has to say. Science, being the systematic study of the world through observing and experimenting. Here's what science tells us. Science tells us that our society and our infrastructure and our built environment is built on an assumption that we often don't think about that much, and that is that we can have cold years and hot years, we can have wet years and dry periods, but over the long term, it's all going to average out. This assumption governs our building codes, it governs our engineering standards, it governs our energy and our water plans. But today, we are recognizing the fact that this assumption may not be valid anymore. And the range of extremes that we have planned for when we designed our infrastructure may not be valid anymore either. We're seeing the 100-year flood become the 10-year flood. We're seeing heat waves that you'd more commonly see in Louisiana occur all the way up to Chicago. We're seeing changes like this, and now we're actually going to get into some of the work that I do. This is an analysis we did for Illinois. We showed what Illinois would feel like in the future depending on the choices that we make. If we continue to depend on coal and gas and oil for our primary source of energy, that's the red state. If we continue to transition to renewable sources of energy, then that's the yellow state. We refrain from the obvious blue and red, because they're both getting warmer. So when you tell people in Illinois that a summer in Illinois will feel like East Texas, that gives a very vivid picture of why we would care about climate change. And in the same way, when you take the tri-state area around New York and you say, well, we have a choice of either feeling like Virginia or feeling like South Carolina does within 50, 60 years. This brings it home why we care about climate change. Because New York City is not built to the same standards as Wilmington. We look at things like this, days per year over 100 degrees. In West Texas, where we live, let's see, does this work? Nope. Is this? Yes. We live right here in West Texas. There's an average of only about 9 days a year over 100 degrees, but in 2011, we had almost 50 days over 100 degrees. And here's the thing. That's going to be the average summer if we continue on our current pathway within most of our lifetimes. And everybody knows what 2011 felt like. What happens if we continue on our pathway through the end of the century? It's going to look like this. And this is far outside the range of anything that our built environment was ever intended to cope with in Texas and through much of the Southeast and Southwest, I should say. We're already seeing these things happen. In Australia, this is nothing in the future. This is 2 years ago in Australia. They had to add a new color to their temperature map because they had a heat wave so severe that they had a huge area in the middle of Australia over 54 degrees Celsius. That's 129 degrees Fahrenheit. They had to add a new color to their map because they'd never been that hot before. Why do we care about heat? It's because it affects us. It affects people. It affects our health, and it affects people that we love. We're seeing more frequent extreme rain and snow already. This is the observed trend over the last 60 years. A lot of my observed figures come from the National Climate Assessment. If you're looking for them, they're all available online. You can download them yourself. We've seen major increases in heavy rain, heavy snow, and flood events in the Northeast and the Midwest. Why do we care about these? Because they bring floods, crazy floods, like in North Dakota, in Calgary, and 1 month ago where I live in Lubbock. We've had a drought since 2011, a crazy, crazy drought, and it broke last month. It broke with more than 9 inches of rain in 1 week, and in some places in the city, an extra 3 inches in an hour on top of that. This is a 6-lane highway, and those are cars underwater beside our football stadium last month. So we are seeing these extremes becoming more and more extreme. Our droughts are getting stronger because it's warmer. The warmer it is, the more water evaporates. Our heavy rainfall is getting more extreme because the more water evaporates, when a storm comes through, it picks up all that water and it dumps it. So not only are we seeing our range of variability tilting, remember that wiggly line, tilting? We're also seeing the range growing over time. And that has enormous implications, not for the polar bear, but for us. We expect these trends to continue. This is some work that we've done for Delaware. We've done similar work for Austin. We're working with DC now. We've worked with Chicago before. We're looking at increases here, for example, in heavy rain events. And this information is useful because if you're putting in a new stormwater system, you want to know, should we make the pipes this big or should we make them this big? If it's going to last for 80 years, 100 years, we need to know what's going to happen during that time, and that's why this information is so useful. Down here, we care a lot about this, right? Now, this isn't Katrina, this is Rita. But whenever we see a hurricane, they often show something underneath the hurricane. What are these colors underneath the hurricane? They're ocean temperatures. Why are we looking at ocean temperatures? Because that's where the energy comes from to feed the hurricanes. The warmer the ocean water, the stronger the hurricanes. So we're not seeing any more frequent hurricanes. We aren't. But we are seeing stronger hurricanes. And not only that, but when the hurricanes come, they're coming on top of higher sea level. So when we get events like Superstorm Sandy, people often say, well, was Sandy occurring because of climate change? I think I have a picture of Sandy right there. Yeah, that's the aftermath. Sandy in and of itself was not unusual. There's about 1 tropical storm that makes it all the way up to New York in the month of October, on average every 5 years. So Sandy was not unusual in that it occurred. What was unusual about Sandy? The ocean water was very warm. It gave Sandy way more strength than it would have otherwise, making it enormous. And it was occurring on top of higher sea level than would have been there 50, 80, 100 years ago. So some of the areas flooded by Sandy would not have been flooded if it wasn't for climate change. That's why climate change matters. Here, though, over the coming century, we stand to lose the areas in black and have the areas in red flooded by coastal storms. We stand to lose half the Everglades, most of the Florida Keys, in this century, if our current trends continue. But in Bangladesh, they stand to lose the land where they grow half of their rice and where 18 million people live, who have nowhere else to go. When we look around the world, we see that our billion-dollar disasters, even accounting for the fact that we have a lot more infrastructure now than we used to, even accounting for that, our billion-dollar disasters are starting to go up because of these extremes. And here's something that you may not know. We scientists are often accused of being alarmists. And I can tell you, we hate being called an alarmist. We hate it. Scientists are not alarmists. They're ultra-cautious, ultra-conservative. And it turns out that because of our bias, we have, in fact, been very conservative in our projections. Over the last 20 years, we have systematically been on the low side of almost every prediction we've made over the last 20 years. How fast Greenland's melting, how fast the Earth is warming, how fast the ocean is taking up heat, we've been systematically too low. That actually led Naomi Oreskes and her colleagues to coin a syndrome for us. She claims that scientists suffer from ESLD. That is erring on the side of least drama. Rather than being drama queens, we are anti-drama queens. We deliberately are downweighting our information because we are so scared of being called alarmists. So that's the science. But now let's talk about the faith part of it. Because it is not, agreeing with the science is not a religion. But figuring out what to do about it is where our faith does come in, and our values. How does this connect to our values? Well, we looked at this figure earlier. This is just a black and white version of where our carbon emissions are coming from. But what we didn't look at was this next figure, who is most impacted by it. This is where this information starts to move from our heads down to our hearts. Because again, science can tell us if climate change is real, yes. Science can tell us why it's happening because of our decisions. Science can even tell us if we continue on our current pathway or if we make changes, what the outcome will be. But science cannot tell us what to do because that is a values choice. And so that is why it is so important to connect this issue to our hearts as well. Because I believe that each one of us has the values in our hearts, whatever faith tradition we may follow, whatever values we were brought up with, whether it's a stitch in time saves 9 and turn out the lights when you leave the room, or if it's a value like this, loving your neighbor, caring for those who don't have enough, who don't have the resources we do. This is what provides the motivation for change. We have to connect these cold, hard facts with the love in our hearts for ourselves, for our family, for our community, and for others around the world. And that's the only way I think we're going to do something about this problem. Now, I love being able to participate in this show, and it's on iTunes now if you want to get it. And a lot of the episodes are actually on YouTube for free too. Because this show shows how it's a people problem. Climate change is not a natural problem. It is a problem because it affects people here. It affects people in Syria. It affects people in Greenland. It affects people all over the world. And this really brings that home. So lastly, what can we do about this? This is a picture, I should say, from Texas, where shiny white wind turbines are rapidly replacing a lot of the old rusting oil rigs around. They're being put up on the land of farmers and ranchers who couldn't care less about hugging a tree or a polar bear. There are no trees or polar bears to hug in West Texas. They're going up because they just make sense. And that was what makes me feel so hopeful about this problem, is we are seeing changes even in Texas. But, Gallup has been asking people, do you think the seriousness of this problem is exaggerated? And over the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, we have been at an all-time high of people thinking that this is no big deal. Not only that, but this is the figure that shocked me the most this year. This asks, what issues do Democrats and Republicans most differ on? Now, the number one is obviously the performance of the president, as it should be, because otherwise, why are you Republican or Democrat, right? Number 2 was climate change. Number 3 was gun control. Number 4, trust scientists, and then the Arctic and weather. I never thought I would ever see a poll where climate change was a more politically divisive issue than gun control and abortion in the United States, but it is. And not only that, but our media's desire to always present both sides of an argument, to have one talking head here saying, oh yes, it's real and important, and the other talking head saying, oh, it's no big deal. Our media's desire to present a fair and balanced perspective is actually feeding us false information. On CNN last year, 30% of the information on climate science was incorrect. Now you're wondering why there's a blank spot there. Here it comes. This is another network, where 72% was incorrect. But I would just like to point out that the previous year, over 90% was incorrect, so they're getting better. Good news. Why is this happening? I mean, don't people know how serious this is? Well, it's happening for a lot of different reasons, and that's why this is such a tough problem to address. We cannot ignore the fact that we are being fed false information. And this is laid out in great detail in this book, Merchants of Doubt, which is a movie now. The movie's going to come out in March. So if you want to go see the movie, it's a good movie because it actually talks to people who are generating, creating, and propagating this false information. It says why you're doing it. And they just let the camera roll. But we have to recognize that we're not asking for a small change either. Each of us, on average, uses the equivalent of 200 slaves to produce the energy we use today. Slavery was replaced by fossil fuels in our society, and we are asking people to divest themselves from fossil fuels. We know how well that went last time. We're not asking for a small change. We aren't. But part of the problem, too, is the fact that we see the solutions to climate change, taxes, legislation, government control, we see those as costly and painful and an imminent risk to our way of life. On the other hand, we see the future impacts as small, irrelevant, up in the Arctic, far away from where we live and from our lives. Here's the bottom line, though. Our choices matter. Are we going to continue to depend on fossil fuels, or are we going to transition in a very sensible, sustainable way to using less energy and getting our energy from different places? The choice matters. As John Holdren, the President's Science Advisor, said, we basically have three choices. We can reduce our emissions, that's mitigate. We can prepare for a different future, that's adapt. Or, and this is a word you don't hear scientists saying a lot, we can suffer. We are going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be. The more we reduce our emissions, the less we have to prepare for a different future, and the less suffering there will be. You see what he's doing there? He's connecting the head with the heart. So that's why solutions are so important, and that's why what you do is so important. Because when I go to a conference at the new Michigan School of Business, and it's in this amazing LEED building, it's just so inspiring to see these creations in front of our eyes. We have an invisible problem, but we have very visible solutions. And that is what is so encouraging, to see these visible solutions, to see the city of Chicago putting green roofs on their buildings to reduce their urban heat island effect when we told them it's going to get warmer because of climate change. To see that we can now buy LEDs at every single local hardware store. And people are buying them. In fact, they're out of stock in Lubbock, Texas. I had an electrician come in and tell me about these wonderful light bulbs, and I'm like, sold, I want that. And he's like, oh, well, it's on 6-month back order because everybody wants them. That's fantastic. Remembering more conservative ways. This is the oldest house in America. We have a ranching heritage center in Lubbock, Texas, and when you go into the adobe houses that were built 100, 200 years ago, it's 95 degrees outside. You walk into the house, it's 70 inside the house. Because we used to know how to build, and we still do. In Holland, they're building floating villages. What happens when sea level goes up 4 feet? You add 4 feet to your anchor chain. Big deal. These are the amazing things we can do to prepare for a different future. We can alter our urban environment in the south side of Chicago so that when we get these heat waves, rather than having fights, looting, illnesses, all kinds of terrible problems which they have today, they actually staff their emergency response by the thermometer in South Chicago. Instead of that, we can have green spaces where people can actually live through these heat waves. But the bottom line, and the reason why I've actually committed my time to serve as scientific advisor to this organization, for example, is because we have to take advantage of the democracy in which we live, because this is a collective problem. It is true that individual actions will never solve this problem. So that is why getting together like we are now, and getting together in a bigger sphere to tell our leaders at the community level, at the state level, and at the national level that we care about this issue is essential to solving it. Because the bottom line is this. What are the terrible consequences of being wrong about climate change? We have energy independence, where we grow our own energy right here at home. We have clean air, we have clean water, we have healthy local economies. We have much more livable cities and sustainable communities. These are the terrible consequences of being wrong about climate change. So the bottom line is, why not? That's it. Thank you. I think we have a couple people with microphones going up and down, so if anybody has questions. Let's see. Nora's getting it, and then Nora, there are 2 people down here too with questions.
How are you getting your message out?
Good question. That's something that I try to think about as much as I can, because all of us have limited time. And what's the most effective way to reach people? So, for example, usually when I go speak to groups, my general policy is to only accept an invitation if they would never have another climate scientist. And I can tell those invitations because the phone call usually starts something along the lines of, well, we've never had a climate scientist before, but so-and-so said that you would be okay. So I do that. I try to, put as many resources and videos online. I try to connect with existing organizations to provide input to them, to provide to whoever they connect to rather than trying to build something new. But I'm definitely open to suggestions because I feel like everybody needs to know. So thank you. Oh, here and then over there next.
Hi.
Hey.
You obviously presented a lot of data and scientific studies, but are there other climate scientists who would have a counter argument to your interpretation, and or like what is the opposition in the scientific community to your findings and other people's findings?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Here in the US, I think I could pretty much count on the fingers of one hand the scientists you could find who would stand up and say something significantly different than what I said. Whereas on the other hand, if you wanted somebody to say the same thing, you would have your pick from probably 5,000 or 6,000 people. So that's kind of the ratio that we're looking at here in the United States. But I've been curious myself as to why those people, who I can count on the fingers of my hand, why they would say something different. So I've actually spent quite a bit of time reading their books, reading some stuff they've written, listening to their interviews. And what has struck me is when I read their books and when I watch their interviews and people ask them about their objections to the science of climate change, almost within the same breath, often within the same chapter of their book, they transition immediately to the problems they have with the solutions. Specifically, the idea that the solutions require big government, and they are fundamentally opposed to government intervention in people's personal lives. So based on that, I have to draw the conclusion that they are starting with their political ideology, and then they are moving backwards into the science in terms of connecting their heart with their head. Whereas as a scientist, I feel like we definitely need to engage our hearts and what we care about and what we're passionate about, but I think that our hearts have to be informed by the science rather than vice versa. Over here, there was a question?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a training, I'm at the mic standing up
Oh,
here.
yeah. Where are you? Okay.
I went to a training put on by the Climate Reality Project, so Al Gore's nonprofit, and he has a video of you talking about the increased water in the atmosphere.
Okay.
And he
I didn't know that.
he talks about you as being a Republican in your personal life, and I'm curious if there's truth to that, and if so, how you work with the two seemingly contradictory things.
That is so funny. I had no idea. I am Canadian, and in Canada, thank you. I see a few fellow Canadians. In Canada, it's really interesting because we don't identify ourselves by our political party. So I have yet to meet a Canadian who says that I'm a Liberal or I'm an NDP or I'm a whatever, unless you're actually running for office. But that said, I have married into a very Republican family. My husband is Republican. My father-in-law was a lawyer and a Republican politician. So I have married into that, and it's been a great experience for me to understand what the real objections are, because when we first got married, my husband didn't think that climate change was real. But I, being this naive Canadian, I had never met anybody who didn't think it was real, so I just assumed he did. And he, being from the southern US and very conservative, had never met anybody who didn't. So we got married, and then it seriously took about 6 months before we figured. And then after about, our jaws kind of just hung open for a couple of weeks as we absorbed the astonishing fact that we had married somebody who was so different than us. But then we sat down and we started to talk. And that is really, I think, the bottom line to why I'm doing what I'm doing, because through talking with my husband, who's a very smart man, has a PhD in linguistics, understands statistics. Through talking to him, I did not start with the assumption that he must not understand. I started with the assumption that he knows what science is, he knows what facts are, he knows what data is, he knows what statistics are. So it took us probably 2 years to talk it all the way through. We didn't want to do this every day, that gets really boring. But we kind of gnawed away at it until finally we agreed about the science. But through that process, I learned how people who object to the reality of this issue are not doing so because they're stupid. They're very smart. In fact, studies have subsequently shown that people who don't think climate change is real often have more concrete reasons for that than people who do. So I think, first of all, that there's nothing un-Republican about agreeing with the science. And I also think that there are solutions that Republicans can accept. But by politicians denying the science, they're effectively cutting themselves off from the solutions conversation. So of course, if you don't like the solutions, you can complain about them, but you didn't help, you didn't offer something else. And so that's why I think this political polarization is so sad, because instead of getting a wide range of solutions across the entire political spectrum, we're only getting solutions from the half of our leaders who actually think this is a real problem. And that's as political as I get. Do I have time for one more question? Yes.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi.
Great presentation. I loved it. Just wanted to compliment you on that.
Thank you.
Do you have any information on why, or my question really is, if we're taking oil out of the ground, what is the oil's purpose within the ground? Do you know?
Yeah.
It's why I don't.
Why is it there?
Yeah, why is it there, and is it bad to take it out at all?
Mm-hmm. Great question. That's an awesome question. In fact, I think that's the first time anybody's ever asked me that. It's there because it's formed from decayed organisms. That's where carbon comes from. So in the natural way of things, that carbon would eventually be released into the atmosphere over millions of years. What's happening is we are accelerating that process, releasing it into the atmosphere over months and years and decades instead of millions of years. So the problem is not that it's being released to the atmosphere. The problem is that we're doing it so quickly. That's the problem. Now, logistically speaking, if I ruled the world, what I would do is I would save those oil resources until we got to the point where a next ice age was going to be coming. Now, just so you know, we have staved off the next ice age indefinitely at this point because we've gone so far in the other direction. So the next 5,000 years, no worries, no ice age. But at some point in the Earth's history, there is going to be another ice age coming. And when we got to that point, I would want to have that nice oil there to dig it out and burn it to stave off the ice age, if I would live for 10,000 years. So I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with using the oil. It's how we're using it. You know what I mean? It's the same with almost everything. There's nothing wrong with food, but how we use food can lead to problems. Nothing wrong with even vitamins, but how we use vitamins can also lead to problems, or medicine, or drugs. So, yes, last question.
Right. Can you let folks know a little bit more about the Citizen Climate Lobby? Because I think what they're proposing is something that could potentially actually gain bipartisan support.
Yes, that's a great question. Citizens Climate Lobby, let me just tell you a bit more about that. Why I love them is because they're not an organization of scientists and they're not an organization of activists. It's just people, real estate agents, teachers, stay-at-home parents, who have never written an op-ed in their lives, wouldn't know how to meet with a congressman or woman if it wasn't for other people helping us figure out how to. What CCL has is they actually have a solution, a specific solution they propose, to put a real price on carbon and to give the extra money back to the people. And who doesn't like to get more money back? Speaking for myself as a scientist, I'm actually quite agnostic on solutions because honestly, I feel like anything's better than nothing. But I love the fact that people are getting on board and proposing viable solutions that actually have big carrots attached to them, not just sticks. So, thank you very much.